I've always believed in creating a sense of peace in my home. As a yoga instructor, my backyard was my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind and practice in private. I'd set it up carefully over the years, adding potted plants, string lights, and a small koi pond. By March of 2023, it was perfect. Every morning and evening, I'd roll out my yoga mat in the soft grass surrounded by flowers and the quiet sounds of nature. It felt like my own little world. Safe, untouched. But all of that changed in the span of a single afternoon. It was a Wednesday. The weather was perfect. A clear blue sky and sunlight so warm that I felt like spring had come early. I had a private client in the morning, but the rest of my day was free, so I decided to spend the afternoon tidying up the backyard shed. The little building sat at the far corner of my garden. It was nothing fancy, just a spot where I kept tools, gardening supplies, and odds and ends. Still, every spring, I made it a point to clean it out, organizing my shelves, tossing what I didn't need. It started off fine. I put on some music and set to work, clearing out rusted trowels and rearranging flower pots. About an hour in, I decided to move a heavy box of tools sitting on a bottom shelf. As I shifted it, something slipped out from behind it and hit the ground. At first glance, I thought it was a battery pack or some kind of gadget, but when I picked it up, I felt my stomach lurch. It was a small, black camera. I stared at it for a second, trying to make sense of what I was holding. It was sleek and modern, like one of those mini spy cameras you see in movies. My immediate thought was that it had to be some old tech my ex-boyfriend left behind. He was big into gadgets. But then I noticed the tiny, blinking light. The camera was still on. A weird, cold unease settled over me as I turned it in my hands. I hadn't been back here in weeks. Who would leave a camera running in my shed? I flipped open the small panel on the back. It had a memory card. My curiosity won out over my nerves, and I hurried back to the house with the camera, sliding the card into my laptop. The folder popped open right away, and as the first video played, I felt my skin go clammy. It was me. The footage was grainy but clear. There I was, on my yoga mat, moving through poses in the center of my backyard. My stomach twisted as I clicked through the files. There were dozens of them. Different times of day, different outfits. Some were from early mornings, the sun just rising behind me. Others at sunset when the yard glowed orange and pink. And then I saw something that made my hands shake. One video showed me sitting on the back porch, legs tucked under me, sipping tea and talking on the phone. It was from last week. The realization sank in like a weight. Someone had been watching me. Not just while I practiced yoga, but during quiet moments when I thought I was alone. I shut the laptop and sat in stunned silence, replaying every moment I'd spent outside over the last month. I'd always felt so comfortable out there, so sure that my high fences and thick hedges kept me shielded from the world. Now that illusion was gone. Someone had violated my space, and the worst part was, I didn't know who. After a few minutes, I forced myself to take action. I marched back to the shed, determined to search every inch of it. My hands shook as I pulled boxes off the shelves and checked behind tools. Nothing. I scanned the trellis, the nearby fence line, and even the koi pond. Still nothing. But when I turned toward the back corner of the yard, something caught my eye. The fence. One section of the wooden slats looked slightly out of place. The angle was off, as though someone had tried to pry them loose and then hastily put them back. I walked over and crouched down, shining my flashlight along the gap. There were faint scuff marks in the dirt, like someone had climbed through. My entire body was buzzing with tension. My backyard wasn't as private as I'd thought. Back inside, I paced the living room, trying to decide what to do next. Call the police? What would I even say? Someone hid a camera in my shed, but I don't know when or who. I settled for locking all the doors and windows, pulling the curtains tight, and sleeping with a heavy wrench next to my bed. The next morning, I packed up the camera, put the memory card in a Ziploc bag, and drove straight to the police station. I felt ridiculous explaining it to the officer at the desk, like I was overreacting, but the moment I showed her the videos, the seriousness in her face was unmistakable. She took my information and said they'd look into it. What followed were some of the longest days of my life. I jumped every time I heard a noise outside, constantly peeking through the blinds and double-checking the locks. I even stopped practicing yoga, my backyard now feeling like a stage where I'd been performing without knowing it. A few days later, the police called me. The officer's voice was calm, but what she told me hit me like a punch to the gut. "We traced the camera back to your next-door neighbor," she said. "He'd been sneaking into your yard at night and placing it there. We found additional footage on his computer." Additional footage? My voice felt far away, like it didn't belong to me. "Yes, it appears he's been doing this for months, recording you whenever you were outside. We're charging him with stalking, trespassing, and invasion of privacy." I don't remember much of what I said after that. I just remember hanging up and sinking onto the couch, staring at the wall in silence. My neighbor, the man I'd waved to countless times, who'd smiled at me over the fence while watering his garden. I'd never given him a second thought. The police confiscated his equipment, and he moved out a week later, but my sanctuary was gone. Every time I stepped into the yard, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I installed security cameras on every corner of the house and replaced the old wooden fence with a taller, reinforced one. I even adopted a big, loud dog for good measure. For months, I couldn't relax out there. Even when my friends visited and we sat on the porch laughing and talking, I'd catch myself looking toward the fence with a creeping feeling that someone was watching. It's been almost a year now, and while the backyard feels a little more like home again, I'll never see it the same way. I still practice yoga, but only indoors, where I can lock the doors and draw the blinds. I've come to accept that you can never really know the people around you, not completely. The smiling neighbor, the friendly stranger. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And sometimes the safest places can be anything but. I've always prided myself on being the kind of guy who gets along with his neighbors. You lend out a lawnmower here, watch someone's house while they're on vacation there. It's what keeps a neighborhood from feeling like just another collection of houses. When my neighbor to the left moved out and the place sat empty for months, it felt a little strange, like something was missing from the usual rhythm of life. So when a guy named Todd moved in during early May of 2021, I was happy to introduce myself. Todd was about my age, mid-30s, maybe a little younger. He was friendly right off the bat, that perfect mix of chatty and polite. We shook hands and I learned he was between jobs and trying to get a fresh start in Raleigh. He said something vague about moving down from New York, but I didn't push it. People move for all kinds of reasons. I offered to help him with a few boxes and he politely declined, saying he had it handled. Over the next few weeks, Todd seemed like a solid guy. He'd wave when I pulled into the driveway, ask how my day was going, and even complimented the work I'd done on my garden. One Saturday morning, he wandered over while I was cleaning out the garage. "Wow, man," he said, looking at my shelves. "You've got all the tools anyone could need." I laughed, not thinking anything of it. Hazard of being a homeowner, you never know what project's coming next. That's when Todd asked if he could borrow a power drill. He had some shelves to hang up, he said. It wasn't a big deal. I've loaned tools to plenty of people, so I handed it over. A couple of days later, he returned it with a thanks and a smile. Looking back, it was so casual. Nothing about it raised any red flags. But a month later, I started noticing little things. At first, it was vague. A wrench I swore I'd put back in my toolbox wasn't there when I needed it. A pair of work gloves I'd left on my workbench disappeared. I figured I'd misplaced them. It wasn't like I kept the place spotless. One night, though, I went to grab a stepladder from the shed out back and found the door slightly ajar. I was sure I'd latched it earlier that day. Nothing looked out of place, but it made me pause. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe I'd just forgotten to close it all the way. Then Todd's behavior started to shift. He still acted friendly, but he started showing up more often. He'd knock on my door just to chat, lingering longer than seemed natural. One time he asked what time I usually left for work in the mornings, which struck me as odd. "Just curious, man," he said with an easy grin. "I wanted to ask if you'd need any help with that fence you're fixing up. I'm around most mornings." Something about it didn't sit right. Who notices someone's schedule like that? One evening, after I got home from work, I decided to take stock of my garage. I didn't tell anyone, but I'd started feeling paranoid, like I needed to double check that everything was where it belonged. I went through my shelves carefully. It wasn't just my imagination. A couple of things were definitely missing. My ratchet set was gone. So was a flashlight I kept hanging from a hook. I didn't want to believe it was Todd. He'd been so nice. But the more I thought about it, the more suspicious he seemed. I decided I'd bring it up if I got the chance, just casually to see how he'd react. That chance came sooner than I expected. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water. My kitchen window overlooks the backyard, and as I stood there, I noticed movement through the trees near the edge of my property. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray dog, but then I saw a figure moving toward Todd's house. He was carrying something large and heavy, but the moonlight wasn't enough to make out what it was. I squinted, and that's when I saw him. It was Todd. I stood there for a long moment. Why was he sneaking around in the middle of the night? And what was he carrying? The next morning, I decided to confront him. I waited until I saw him out on his porch with a coffee mug, pretending like everything was normal. I walked over casually, keeping my tone friendly. "Hey Todd, weird question for you," I said. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about some tools going missing, would you? I've been noticing a few things out of place in my garage." Todd's smile faltered just a little before he recovered. "Nah, man, haven't seen anything. I mean, I've got enough on my plate with unpacking." Something about his tone felt off. Too casual, too quick. "You sure? You were out pretty late last night," I added, watching him closely. His expression tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just noticed you coming back from somewhere. Looked heavy, whatever you were carrying." For a second, Todd didn't say anything. Then he forced a smile, but the emptiness in his eyes gave him away. "You're mistaken, man. I was home all night." I knew he was lying. That evening, I decided I'd had enough. I called the landlord of the property next door, explaining that I was concerned about my new neighbor. The landlord's response floored me. "Neighbor? I haven't rented that house out yet." "What do you mean you haven't rented it out? Someone's living there right now." He introduced himself as Todd. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, no one is supposed to be in that house. I'll come by tomorrow with the police to check it out." That night, I kept checking the windows, expecting to see Todd staring back at me. By morning, the police and the landlord showed up and we knocked on the door of the house next door. There was no answer. When the officers broke the lock and stepped inside, the truth came spilling out. Todd, or whatever his real name was gone. The house was practically empty, except for a pile of stolen items in the basement. My ratchet set, my flashlight, and tools I'd assumed I'd lost were all there, along with things that clearly belonged to other neighbors. A bike, a few power tools, even a box of jewelry. The officers said he'd probably been squatting there for months, using the house as a base to steal from people in the area. They found signs he'd been sneaking in and out through the back door, sometimes crossing my property to avoid the main road. I don't know where Todd went. The police put out a report, but as far as I know, he was never found. I spent the next week installing new locks on everything: the house, the garage, the shed. I even put up security cameras. I'm still friendly with my neighbors, but I'll never trust someone so quickly again. Todd played me perfectly. He seemed harmless, helpful even, like the kind of guy you'd have a beer with. But it was all an act. And the scariest part is how good he was at it. When I first moved into my apartment in Portland, I loved it immediately. It was one of those older, charming places with hardwood floors, crown molding, and those vintage vents built into the walls. The kind of place that made you feel like you were living in a slice of history. As a freelance graphic designer working from home, I was excited to settle in, make the space my own, and enjoy the peace and quiet it offered. For the first couple of weeks, everything was great. I rearranged furniture, decorated the walls, and settled into my little nook by the window where the morning light was perfect for sketching. But after a while, I started noticing something strange. I'd hear noises coming from the vents. At first, it was like soft scratching or the occasional thump. My mind immediately jumped to the logical explanation: mice or rats in the ducts. Old buildings like mine often had pest problems, and while it wasn't ideal, it wasn't the end of the world. I made a note to mention it to my landlord and tried to let it go. The noises didn't happen all the time. They would start up for a few minutes and then stop completely, like whatever it was just disappeared. Sometimes I'd be sitting at my desk and catch myself pausing, holding my breath as I listened, and then I'd hear nothing. I started convincing myself I was just imagining it. I had been stressed lately with deadlines, and maybe I just needed a break. One evening, though, I was working late, pushing through a last-minute design project for a client. It was quiet except for my laptop fan. Out of nowhere, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just scratching, it was a shuffle, like something moving. I turned my head toward the vent on the wall across the room. It was one of those vintage metal grates with small diamond-shaped openings. I couldn't see anything inside, just darkness, but the sound was clearer than ever. I got up and crouched down near the vent, leaning in closer. And then, I swear to you, I heard a faint whisper. Not words, not exactly, but the soft sound of breathing. The moment I leaned in further, it stopped. My stomach dropped. I stayed frozen for a second before jerking back and standing up so quickly I nearly tripped over myself. "Nope, no way," I mumbled aloud, trying to laugh it off, though my voice shook. "You're losing it." I went to bed that night, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was my imagination, that it was late, I was tired, and old vents made weird noises. But still, I found myself lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the apartment. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel safe. The next morning, I called my landlord. I explained that I thought there might be mice in the vents or something else making noise. He said he'd send someone over to check it out later that day. That afternoon, the repairman showed up. He was a short, gruff guy with a thick gray beard, and he looked like he'd seen it all. I explained what I'd heard. "Rats, probably," he said with confidence. "They like to get into the ducts. Easy access from the crawl space or an adjoining unit." He grabbed his tools and disappeared into the building's shared attic space. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling aimlessly on my phone, trying to ignore how tense I felt. About half an hour later, he came back down, looking different. His expression was tight, and he didn't meet my eye. "Find anything?" I asked, setting down my mug. He hesitated. "Yeah," he said slowly, scratching the back of his head. "Someone's been messing with the vents. Covers are loose, like they've been taken off and put back on. It looks like someone's been crawling through them." I blinked at him, unsure if I heard right. "Wait. Someone?" He nodded, his face serious. "I think you should talk to your landlord. This isn't rats." I stood there, speechless, as he packed up his tools and left. Crawling through the vents, the idea made my skin crawl. I called my landlord immediately, and he promised to look into it. That night, though, I couldn't shake the image from my head. Someone squeezing through those dark ducts, moving through the walls of the building. By the next day, I hadn't heard back from the landlord, so I decided to do some investigating on my own. I went to the adjoining apartment next to mine, the one on the other side of my bedroom wall. It had always seemed empty. No noise, no lights. But I'd never really paid much attention. I knocked on the door. No answer. The door looked dusty, like it hadn't been used in weeks. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening for any sign of life, but it was silent. That night, the sounds came back. I was sitting on my couch when I heard it again. Shuffling, a soft thud, and then breathing. I turned off the TV, and the apartment fell deathly quiet. The noise was coming from the vent above the floor near the couch. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and slowly, I crept toward the vent and shined the beam into the darkness. At first, all I could see was dust and the faint outline of metal tubing. But as I moved the light around, something caught my eye, a glint, like the reflection of an eye. I stumbled back so fast I fell onto the floor, the flashlight clattering beside me. My chest heaved as I stared at the vent, the beam of light still illuminating it. Nothing moved. The eye was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I pushed my couch against the vent and left every light in the apartment on. First thing in the morning, I called the police. I told them someone was in the vents, that someone had been crawling through them and watching me. I sounded like a lunatic, but I didn't care. When the police showed up, they went into the attic and checked the vent system thoroughly. They were up there for over an hour before they came back down. One of the officers asked me to sit down. "We found signs that someone's been going in and out of the vents," he said. It looks like they were accessing the vents from an adjoining unit." I swallowed hard. "Which unit?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "The apartment next to yours," he said. "Your landlord confirmed it's been vacant for months." The police launched an investigation and eventually tracked down the man responsible. My neighbor from across the hall. He'd been sneaking into the vacant apartment, crawling into the vent system and using it to watch me. They found small holes drilled into the vent covers, just big enough to see through. The man was arrested, but I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things and moved out as soon as I could. Even now, I still can't sit near vents without looking at them nervously. And I avoid older buildings altogether. I know it sounds paranoid, but once you realize someone's been watching you in your home, in your most private moments, it changes the way you see everything. The truth is, you never really know who's watching, and sometimes they're closer than you think. I've always trusted Max, my 7-year-old German Shepherd, to be my alarm system, my protector, and my loyal shadow. As a dog groomer, I work long hours, but Max is always at my side when I'm home. We live in a quiet neighborhood in Buffalo, a place where snow blankets everything in a soft hush by mid-December. I'd always found comfort in the silence until last winter when the silence started feeling wrong. It began as a nagging observation. Max wasn't barking anymore. For as long as I'd had him, Max barked at anything unfamiliar. The mailman, squirrels, even the wind rattling the fence sometimes. It was his thing. At night especially, he'd patrol the yard like clockwork, his deep bark ringing out at the slightest sound. It made me feel safe, knowing he'd alert me if anything was off. But last December, the barking stopped. At first, I thought maybe he was just tired. Dogs mellow out as they age, right? I brushed it off for a few nights. I was busy with the holiday rush at work, grooming every golden retriever and doodle in Buffalo, it seemed. I barely had time to think. But every time I let Max out into the yard at night, I noticed he'd just stand there, staring at the fence instead of running along it like he usually did. He'd sniff the air a little, tail low, before trotting back inside without making a sound. I remember joking to myself, "Guess you're retiring early, huh, Max?" But deep down, something didn't sit right. A week passed, and then came the night I decided to check the cameras. I had a basic security setup, 2 motion sensor cameras facing the yard, one near the back porch and another near the fence gate. They'd served their purpose so far, catching nothing but raccoons. I wasn't expecting anything that night. I just wanted to see if Max had been reacting to something I couldn't hear. It was a little past 11 p.m. when I settled on the couch with my laptop, pulling up the security footage. Max had been acting odd again earlier, just staring at the fence and coming back in without a bark. The live feed showed nothing unusual, just the snow falling in heavy flakes, blanketing the yard. I yawned and started scrubbing through footage from the last few nights. That's when I saw it. On the video from 2 nights before, around midnight, the motion sensor triggered. I leaned in closer to the screen, trying to make out the shape. Then a figure stepped into view, a man. My heart almost stopped as I watched him move toward the fence, hunched over slightly, like he was trying to stay low. He paused near the far corner, where Max usually barked the most. And then, to my horror, he crouched down and reached something through the fence. It was hard to tell what it was, but Max appeared almost immediately on the screen, wagging his tail cautiously as he approached the stranger. The man stayed there for nearly a minute, his hand extended, and Max just accepted it. He ate something from the man's hand. "What the hell?" I whispered to no one. The footage ended with the man disappearing back into the dark, leaving behind no trace but the quiet, snow-covered yard. My brain raced to catch up with what I'd seen. Someone had been in my yard. Someone had been feeding Max. I tried to rationalize it. A neighbor being overly friendly? A misguided stranger leaving treats for a great dog? None of it made sense. The next morning, I took Max straight to the vet. I didn't tell the receptionist much beyond, "He's acting off and I want to make sure he's okay." When the vet came back, she looked concerned. "There's a sedative in his system," she said. "It's mild, but definitely enough to keep him subdued." I felt sick. "What kind of sedative?" She listed off some options, mostly veterinary-grade tranquilizers used for small surgeries, but I barely heard her. Someone had drugged my dog. My mind flashed back to the man on the footage, crouching by the fence in the dead of night, slipping something to Max while I slept inside, oblivious. I knew then that it wasn't random. Someone had done this on purpose, but who? That night, I couldn't relax. I kept replaying the video on my laptop, trying to figure out who the man was, what he had been holding, where he'd come from, or what he wanted. Was he trying to gain Max's trust? To get into my yard unnoticed? My house? The questions looped in my brain as I sat on the couch, watching the live camera feed obsessively. Around midnight, I got my answer. I'd turned off all the lights, leaving the room lit only by the glow of my laptop. I kept looking between the screen and Max, who was snoozing at my feet, drug-free for the first time in days. The yard looked empty, just the snow falling. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then the motion sensor went off. My heart skipped as the screen flickered. The same man appeared, his figure hazy in the snowfall. He moved more quickly this time, heading straight for the corner of the fence where Max had met him before. I could see him holding a small bag, the kind you get from a pharmacy. He crouched again, reaching through the fence. This time, Max didn't move. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I turned on the porch floodlights remotely. The yard lit up in an instant, the snow reflecting the light like a spotlight aimed directly at the man. He froze, his face now visible in the camera feed, an older man, maybe late 60s, with thin, wiry hair poking out from under a hat. Before I could even process it, I yelled through the window, my voice trembling with adrenaline. "Get out of my yard!" The man flinched, looking straight at the camera, straight at me. Something about his expression sent a chill through me. It wasn't anger or guilt. It was almost calm, like he didn't mind being caught. Then, just as quickly, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. I called the police immediately. They arrived about half an hour later, lights flashing across the snow-covered street. I showed them the footage, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. The officers searched the yard and the surrounding area, but of course, the man was long gone. One of the officers stayed back to talk to me. "You said he fed your dog a sedative?" he asked, watching the video over my shoulder. The vet confirmed it. Why would someone do that? Why would he be feeding my dog anything? The officer didn't have an answer for me. He could only speculate. Maybe the man was trying to quiet Max so he could get into the yard. Maybe it was an attempt to break into the house. "People do strange things," he said with a sigh. "We'll file a report and keep an eye out. You did the right thing, scaring him off." I tried to let his words calm me, but they felt hollow. Keep an eye out? What did that even mean? He couldn't promise the man wouldn't come back, and the image of his face, calm and unwavering, was still burned into my mind. I forced a thank you, but deep down I felt like I was on my own. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the police left, I stayed up watching the cameras, jumping at every flicker of movement. Max stayed close to me, his ears perked as if he too was waiting for the man to come back. He never did. The neighbor, well, technically the guy from the back street, turned out to be the one behind it all. His house was a few doors down, just beyond the property behind mine. I didn't see him leave, but he moved out a couple of weeks after the incident. One morning, I noticed his house was empty, the for rent sign back up in the yard. The police never got a clear answer on his motives, but they suspected he'd been trying to scope out my property for something. To steal, maybe. Whatever the reason, all I can say is I'm glad I caught him when I did. If these neighbor nightmares send a chill down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that'll keep you on edge. What would you do if you found out your neighbor wasn't who they seemed? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd handle it. Send this video to a friend who swears their neighbors are weird. And remember, safety starts with awareness. So keep your doors locked and your instincts sharp. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.